Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I'm here to talk about my favorite books from 2019. And normally in the past I've split this up into fiction and nonfiction lists, but I had a pretty mediocre reading year in 2019 all told. So I didn't have that much to choose from, and what I did have to choose from was not that great. But there were a handful of gems from 2019, so it wasn't all for naught. And I do think that my top few books were pretty exceptional and would probably hold up to some of my best books from 2017 and 2018. So on that faintly auspicious note, let's get into it, going from least favorite to most favorite. First up, I have If You Lived Here, You'd Be Home by Now by Christopher Ingraham, which is his memoir of leaving the urban grind of the DC suburbs and moving with his wife and two small children to Red Lake Falls, Minnesota, population 1,400, or as my Minnesotan dad calls it, a frigid, godforsaken outcropping of North Dakota. This is mostly a sentimental favorite just because so many of the little details and anecdotes from this memoir felt as if they had been lifted and transposed from my own experiences growing up in the small town upper Midwest. Little things like all the Lutheran churches and the last lingering remnants of Scandinavian ethnic heritage, having school canceled 2 days in a row because the wind chill is negative 45 degrees Fahrenheit, or the Midwestern approach to cooking being, when in doubt, just add mayonnaise. But then there are also the more perceptive insights, like the fact that people in Red Lake Falls don't seem to give two shits about Minneapolis, let alone some coastal city like New York or Los Angeles. Or there's the observation that kids in Red Lake Falls can run around outside for hours unsupervised, and the proximity to fields and woods and streams gives the kids growing up there a kind of unencumbered freedom that I think can be quite rare in other places. And then, as someone who is always kind of living with this dull, enduring ache for the landscape of the Midwest, the way that Chris Ingraham describes things like the subtle layers of the prairie or the exquisite beauty of a Minnesota winter with its glancing sundogs and the frigid clarity of the night sky, that recognition of the kind of enveloping natural amenities of that region was something that made me feel incredibly moved and also kind of painfully homesick. And so this book has a special place in my heart for that specificity and for the sincerity and love and appreciation that Chris Ingraham has for his adopted home in the upper Midwest. Next, I have These Truths by Jill Lepore, which is her doorstopper history of the United States of America. And despite being such a hefty volume, Jill Lepore writes about history in a way that feels as natural and effortless as the flow of water. She has an incredible talent for evoking the immense tide of history while at the same time plucking out the small details and human moments. And because of that, her account of the history of this nation feels both epic and intimate, both tragic and heroic. And she never lets the reader forget the fundamental truth about America, which is that the United States is a country founded on liberty and bondage. And while I wouldn't call this book radical, that thesis does feel like a departure from mainstream narratives and understandings of American history. And the fact that Lepore is so clear-eyed about both the exceptional promises and the tremendous failures and hypocrisies of this country makes her moments of quiet, wary optimism feel earned. And while no single history of an entire nation will ever be comprehensive or tell every story that should be told, I think this text is an incredibly valuable foundation for anyone who is looking to establish a kind of preliminary understanding of the long arc of American history and how we got to where we are today. Then I have Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston, which is a rom-com set in an alternate reality in which the son of America's first female president falls in love with the Prince of England. It's light, it's frothy, it has an extremely charming protagonist, and it also understands pop culture and celebrity PR in a way that I found particularly satisfying. And that element of the book actually gives what is otherwise a kind of exceedingly sweet story a kind of fun, sharp gossipy undercurrent to help counter the cotton candy of it all. This is also one of the few contemporary romances I've read that feels like it has legitimate stakes and tension, and it also offers this wonderful, fantastical vision of a far more progressive America. And this is definitely a straight-up romance novel. It's not like a novel with some romance in it, so it might not be everyone's speed, but I thought it was just an absolute delight. One of those books that just warms you up inside. And it's also one of the best romances I've read in a long time, not just in 2019. So I highly recommend it for all you romance readers out there and anyone else who's feeling genre adventurous in 2020. Then I have Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer, which is another one of those books that I loved with a kind of whole body enthusiasm that only truly remarkable, riveting storytelling can inspire. This is Jon Krakauer's personal account of the Mount Everest disaster that claimed the lives of 8 climbers in May of 1996. And although a tragedy like this by nature has a kind of sickening, regrettably voyeuristic appeal, what makes Jon Krakauer's account of it so exceptional is that it's not in any way sensational. Instead, it has this kind of surgical meticulousness as Krakauer traces the months and weeks and days and hours leading up to the disaster. And then when calamity does descend on the mountain, he captures perfectly the kind of lethargic, frozen creep of it, the way the catastrophe unfolds in seeming slow motion, set off by a series of small choices and bad judgments and mistakes that end up spelling the difference between life and death. And what makes this story all the more involving is that in one vein, it's incredibly clear-eyed and sobering. The account of a rigorous journalist trying to put together the hard facts and a sequence of events to understand how things got past the point of no return. And then in another vein, Jon Krakauer is very much a central character in this story and is very much emotionally implicated in everything he's recounting. And there's this kind of heartbreaking tension between Jon Krakauer's desire to tell the story as accurately as possible, and then his own internal feelings of guilt and self-doubt and grief and kind of fear of his own misperceptions. And it's so compelling and adds a real pathos and emotional stakes to what is already some knockout writing and storytelling. Next up, I have Uncanny Valley by Anna Wiener, which actually came out just last week, but I read an early copy of it in December and absolutely devoured this book, so I decided to include it on this list. This is Anna Wiener's memoir about leaving the New York City publishing industry in 2013 at the age of 25 to go work in tech in Silicon Valley. And this book chronicles the years that she spent working non-technical customer support roles, first at a data analytics startup and then later at GitHub. And it's part dishy expose of an industry that is more than ripe for it. It's part coming of age story. And then, although it's a cliche to compare young female writers to Joan Didion, it really does read like a goodbye to all that for the Facebook generation. And Anna Wiener is a phenomenal writer, and her insights about the tech world are kind of deliciously incisive. But what makes this book particularly good is that when Anna Wiener aims her pen at the tech industry and the companies and people who populate it, she doesn't spare herself from her own blistering critiques. The way that she interrogates her own desires and her hunger for professional validation, those facets of her personality that make her particularly vulnerable to the seduction of the tech industry's myths about itself. That is some of the most compelling stuff in this book, especially because her personal experience of her initial enchantment with the tech industry and then her later disillusionment with it seems to so closely mirror the cultural experience that we've all had with tech over the past decade. And then on top of all that, although I never worked in tech when I lived in California, reading this book really put me in my Bay Area, San Francisco feelings, just because of the way that she so accurately and unflinchingly captures the contradictions of San Francisco and the whole Bay Area, contradictions that have only become more glaring in the past decade and that present a constant visible moral quandary for everyone living there. There's this passage about her initial experience living in San Francisco after having moved there from New York, and it says, "Homeless encampments sprouted in the shadows of luxury developments. People slept and shat and shot up in the train stations, lying beneath advertisements for fast fashion and productivity apps as waves of commuters studiously avoided eye contact. I woke up one morning to the sound of someone howling for mercy on the corner of my block, a woman screaming bloody murder, dragging one leg, wearing nothing but a torn t-shirt emblazoned with the logo for a multinational consumer electronics company. This concentration of public pain was new to me, unsettling. I had never seen such a shameful juxtaposition of blatant suffering and affluent idealism. It was a well-publicized disparity, but one I had underestimated. As a New Yorker, I had thought I was prepared. I thought I'd seen it all. I felt humbled and naive and guilty all the time." So I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about this book that I'm planning to expound upon in a full review, but until then I did want to get it on this list just to say it's excellent and everyone should go out and read it. Then I have Trick Mirror: Reflections on Self-Delusion by Gia Tolentino, which is a collection of essays in which she reflects upon the various self-delusions of the modern era. And in some of the book's strongest moments, she considers in particular the ways in which the internet and technology and late-stage capitalism have warped our relationship to the self. And I just find Gia Tolentino to be so smart and such a good writer and such a vital chronicler of the cultural miasma that we're all kind of groping our way through. The way that she writes about things like athleisure or sweet green salads or the self as product, it's like she's taking all of these ideas that are floating around in the cultural ether, and then she consolidates and synthesizes them with a sharpness and a precision and a clarity that feels like a revelation. And that clarity does leave room for a certain persistent ambivalence that runs throughout this book, which may in some ways read like a cop-out or a kind of surrendering shrug where you might prefer a more concrete argument or statement or opinion. But as a whole, I think this book is kind of making the case that individual opinion is overrated and certainly overvalued in our current cultural economy. And the fact that Trick Mirror seems far more interested in interrogation and exploration rather than a kind of assertive argumentation or declaration actually feels like a breath of fresh air and an authentic reflection of the very uncertain and distorted times that we're living in. Next up, my second favorite read of 2019 is kind of a cheat because it's the LIVESHIP Traders trilogy by Robin Hobb, which is 3 books, but it's all part of one saga. There's really not a weak link in the whole series, so I'm grouping them all together. This is the story of the Vestrits, who are a family of traders living in a port city called Bingtown. And several of the trading families in Bingtown, the Vestrits among them, own these prized live ships whose figureheads become sentient after 3 generations of the ship's family have died on its decks. And the series follows several members of the Vestrit family, along with a pirate called Kenneth who is intent on capturing a live ship of his own. And I just finished the last book in the series about a week ago, and wow, I loved every minute of it. This was my first time reading fantasy as an adult, and although I was very resistant to the genre for a long time, this ended up being my most rewarding reading experience of the whole year. There's something about being immersed in a particular world for so long that what once felt quite foreign ends up feeling almost like a second home. And these books, especially towards the end of the series, have these scenes of high drama, these moments of narrative intensity that have been building and building over hundreds of pages that then peak and crest and kind of crash into you with wave after wave of emotional payoff, and it's just awesome. And there are moments that feel so epic that you almost feel like you're watching this high concept, high budget TV show, but those thrills are then bolstered by a world building and a character development and a depth of storytelling that you can only get from reading a book. I just adored these books, and I'm going to do a review of the whole series soon, but in the meantime, I can't recommend these books or this series heartily enough. They're just fantastic. And last but not least, it will come as no surprise that my absolute favorite book of 2019 was MILKMAN by Anna Burns. This novel embeds itself in the psyche of a young woman who is navigating day-to-day life in Belfast during the Troubles. And I don't really know what else I can say about this book that I didn't say in the full review I did a few months ago. I feel like I've kind of exhausted all of the intellectual or insightful things that I can say about it. So I will just say that the raw experience of reading it and being immersed in the richness and rhythms of Anna Burns' prose was singular and an absolute unequivocal pleasure. There is so much in this book in the way of language and characters and locality and atmosphere. And running underneath it all is this kind of deep, buried, often suppressed wellspring of human emotion. This book is so dense with human experience and historical injustices, and it's also so moving and so funny. So if you want to hear my full, far more articulate thoughts about this one, I'm going to link my review down below. Suffice it to say, I love this book. I can't sing its praises enough. It was far and away my favorite read of the year. Those were my favorite books of 2019. I'll be back again tomorrow to talk about some of my bookish plans and goals for the coming year. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!